Well, good afternoon. I hope you can hear me okay here. I don't want to start shouting and ranting. What I want to try to do in this lecture then, to get straight to it, is to speak at you for about half an hour, I suppose, and then to take questions for the remainder of our time together. And the intention of the lecture is really to observe and trace the process whereby, as I see it at least, a single sectarian war has broken out and is now raging in the territories still officially known as Iraq and Syria, and to observe also whereby this war is increasingly showing signs of erupting into Lebanon. Should it erupt further into Lebanon, this war will be taking place in the entire and contiguous territory between the Iraq-Iran border and the Mediterranean Sea. What I want to do then is to look, first of all, at the beginnings of the Syrian civil war and at the process by which the country became split into areas of control. And I'll consider each of these in a little bit of detail, and they are the regime area, as I say, the area ruled by the thing that still calls itself the government of Syria, the Kurdish areas, the area ruled by the Islamic State, with which we are all interested, and the remaining rebel areas, which are increasingly dominated by Jabhat al-Nusra, the franchise of Al-Qaeda active in Syria. It's important for me to look at all four, going on from what our chairman said at the beginning, because it is my estimation, at least, that to look correctly at the Islamic State, one needs to see it as only one emergence, only one phenomenon, which is part of a much larger war and a much larger process, rather than seeing the Islamic State as the single and central problem with which we must engage. This is rather an important point, which I hope to go on to demonstrate. So I'll go on to look then in some detail at the IS offensive into Iraq, mentioned at the beginning, and how this has broken the borders of the war. And finally, I'll try to sum up where things currently stand and where perhaps we are headed with all this. So first of all, then, just to recap the facts regarding the Syrian war. Well, we remember that the Assad regime was caught badly unawares by the outbreak of large-scale protests in March 2011. And after a short, rather ham-fisted attempt at introducing a series of reforms, and people may remember the decision to grant citizenship to a few thousand, 20,000 Syrian Kurds, and the sacking of the unfortunate governor of Daraa province, Mr. Faisal Khartoum, and then the decision to permit secondary school teachers, women teachers, to wear the niqab, the full Islamic dress. After these are rather piecemeal and tiny attempts at reform, the Assad regime in mid-April of 2011 effectively went into a situation of frontal confrontation with the protests against it. And this stance has remained in place ever since, Syria being a state of full-fledged civil war effectively since the spring of 2011. Well, over 200,000 people are now dead. There are at least 2.4 million Syrian refugees, with another 6.5 million people displaced inside the country itself. And unknown numbers are in regime custody. But despite the enormous death toll and the enormous suffering, since early 2013, the military situation has effectively been at stalemate. Rebel forces have succeeded in carving out large swathes of territory in the rural north and east, which are now firmly under their control. The regime, however, continues to hold all the major cities in the country, with the exception, of course, of the provincial capital of Raqqa province, Raqqa city, which is held by Islamic State. And the regime also now holds around half of Aleppo, the largest city in the country. The regime, of course, still has Damascus. It holds the Alawi heartland of the western coastal area. And the rebels, in the meantime, have begun to turn on one another. If we turn to look in a little bit of detail at how Syria arrived in that situation, we remember that after an initial unarmed phase of the first few months of rebellion, the organization, or the entity calling itself the Free Syrian Army, was founded on July 29th, 2011. And in the course of the remainder of that year, the Free Syrian Army, never a united or single organization, but rather a generic name given to a whole number of different armed initiatives in different parts of the country, began to carve out areas of control, initially, mainly in the north of the country, initially isolated small areas in which slowly and over time it began to be too dangerous for regime forces to venture into. I spent my first visit, I won't be going into huge anecdotes here, so don't worry, but I spent my first reporting visit into Syria in February 2012, into one of those precarious rebel-controlled areas. And the control was partial, but considerable. That's to say, the regime forces could sweep in any time they wanted, but small patrols of the regime could no longer feel safe coming in there. In February 2012, the regime made a concerted attempt to reconquer these areas and to reassert its authority throughout the country. They wanted to get to re-establish control of the country in time for a ceasefire brokered by former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, which was due to come into being in April 2012. They swept through large parts of rural northern Syria, leaving hundreds dead in their wake. But a dynamic then became, a telling and crucial dynamic then became apparent, and it was that the regime did not have sufficient wherewithal to place all areas in revolt under permanent occupation. That is to say, when the armed forces moved on from a particular area that it had swept through and pacified, the rebellion re-emerged. This exposed the crucial weakness of the Assad regime, which remains in place to this day. And that is a shortage of reliable manpower, a shortage of a sufficient amount of reliable manpower to pacify and to rule the entire country. The regime could conquer ground, but it couldn't hold it. Crucially then, and in a decision which has gone on to define everything that has taken place in Syria since that time, in mid-2012, the regime sought to address this crucial problem by reducing the area of territory it was required to hold. And in July 2012, the regime withdrew from a large swathe of territory in northern Syria, effectively ushering into being two successor authorities. The first being that controlled by the Syrian rebels, and the second, and no less important, an area or a series of areas, 3 areas to be precise, controlled by the country's Kurdish minority. There are today then, or there emerged in mid-2012, 3 enclaves which have defined the run of the Syrian civil war ever since. It is remarkable to note that since mid-2012, over 150,000 people have lost their lives in the Syrian war, but the lines have moved remarkably little. The main way in which the lines have moved, indeed, is not between the 3 enclaves, but rather because one of the enclaves split into 2, thus bringing into being today 4 enclaves rather than 3. The 4 currently in existence being the regime, the Kurds, what remains of the rebel-controlled enclave, and the Islamic State, which emerged as a result of a kind of civil war within the civil war between the ISIS organization and the other rebels, other elements among the rebels. What I want to try and do now then is to look at all 4 of these in a little bit of detail, to look into some detail as to each of these very different entities, the better to understand them before going on to look at the current situation in the country and the developments of recent months. Regarding, first of all then, the Assad regime. The Assad regime has succeeded as of now in maintaining the minimum